go in 5, 4, 3, 2. Welcome to Cultivated Live for Wednesday, September 10th. I am Jay Rosenthal. Two over for me is Jeremy Burke. In the middle is Eric Casey, the managing editor of the Worcester Business Journal. I think I got that right. We're all going back to our roots today in Massachusetts. Eric, thanks for being here. You are, of course, in Worcester, the home of the Worcester Lunch Car Company, the home of the Woo Sox, and an interesting big story that you wrote about cannabis and the current state of affairs in Central Mass. Give us a breakdown. First of all, welcome. Then give us a breakdown of the story you wrote for the Worcester Business Journal.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jay and Jeremy. I really appreciate being here. Yeah, so Worcester is also home of the state's Cannabis Control Commission, one of the few state agencies based outside of the Boston area. And if you go about 45 minutes north of Worcester, you get to Fitchburg, which is where Rev Clinic's cultivation facility was. And for those who aren't familiar with them, they were one of the most prominent cannabis companies in Massachusetts, one of the fastest growing companies of any type in the nation. Back in 2021, they were fourth on the Inc. 5,000 fastest growing list. And today they're in receivership and more or less don't exist anymore. So my story kind of captures the rise and fall of Rev Clinics, who of course had a branding deal with David Ortiz, Red Sox legend, and helped him get into the cannabis industry. And, I kind of cover how the company grew and then how it all came to a demise rather recently with a state appointed receiver, trying to sell off assets to pay what debt they can pay off that this company has accumulated over the last couple of years. So.
Was it too much too fast? Was it regulatory burdens? Was it branding deals that were too expensive, or a bit of all that, plus a market that was new and early and in flux, or sort of all of those things?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of all those things, but I think it was probably a combination of them trying to expand at a time where, the bottom of the market kind of fell out. Prices have dropped, a lot since 2020, when they were first kind of coming onto the scene and becoming one of the more prominent companies in the industry. Prices were over $400 an ounce back in January 2020. Now they're hovering around between $125, $150 an ounce. So that's a hard thing for any business to take on. But when you're trying to expand at the same time, that can be really tricky. And I think from what I can tell, that was sort of the company's main downfall.
And Eric, I want to sort of get into the details of the story a little bit. Like you said, the Big Poppy partnership, they raised $50 million. I wonder what your takeaways are when it seemed like, a very short while ago, 3 or 4 years ago, the company was doing everything right, was hitting all those marks. Obviously, the wholesale price declines are hard to manage against, but what does this say about the broader industry that a company that has these partnerships, that has money in the bank, was doing things right, and things just seem kind of a little bit out of their control at a certain point? What does that say about the industry, and what does that say about the market?
Yeah, well, there's some common themes for people who cover the broader industry that you might pick up on in this piece. I think the accumulation of debt, even when things were going well and money was coming in the door, they were one of the few companies in the state. And, it's kind of rare in general with cannabis companies to be profitable. They're actually bringing in more money than they were spending at one point, which is, something most cannabis businesses can't say. But they accumulated a lot of debt, and with the price falling, that was hard to account for, I think. I think there was just kind of this attitude that, this growth was going to happen forever, that, more states were to come online. They're going to be able to bring Rev Clinics to other states. It just didn't really play out that way. The enthusiasm obviously for the industry isn't what it was a few years ago. And I think that, they just kind of failed to keep that momentum going.
Yeah. And I wonder also, does it have ripple effects or warnings for other operators, specifically in Massachusetts, maybe even specifically in central Massachusetts, that, people are experiencing the pricing across the board, but are there, this is a shock also to, big employers, right? Communities rely on these employment. I think in your story you talked about sort of one of the largest employers. Talk a little bit about the sort of output of that, because that is also a shock to central Massachusetts, but also any community that loses 50, 100, 150 jobs.
Yeah, the city of Fitchburg, it's a former factory town. It's a city that was kind of hard on its luck in the 70s and 80s when a lot of those major employers left. It kind of hollowed out the downtown area of the town. It's been trying to recover ever since. It has kind of slowly been revitalizing itself. It has a state university there. But what this project did is it took a former shoe factory that had been empty for a number of years and brought it back to life. There was 150 workers. One of the main problems Rev Clinics had at its peak was actually parking, because it was actually running out of space for all its employees. Now that parking lot sits empty and the building sits empty, and the owners are trying to find a new life for it. But that was 150 jobs that are no longer at Fitchburg, which for a city of that size is a tough pill to swallow for sure.
Yeah.
And I guess, what does that mean on the jobs question, the employee impacts? What does that mean for other states, in your point of view, that might look to cannabis as a savior, right? Thinking of Maine, there's mill towns which have wanted to bring in facilities. Does this work, and is this something that other states should try, or are these lessons too obvious at this point?
Yeah, I think anytime, cities or towns kind of partner with a business like this, it's tough because they're not in control of the business itself. So they're not in control of what actually happens. And, I think you're kind of bound to see this in a lot of states when they first legalize, especially the earlier states when there's a lot of enthusiasm. People were just, when we had our first sales here in Massachusetts, it was at a place called Cultivated in Leicester. And there was literally a line down the street. People were waiting for 4 or 5 hours. People were driven all the way from, not even just the Northeast, but even like as far as ways, Virginia and stuff like that, just to experience it. And, nowadays that enthusiasm isn't quite there. And, but, when you had that initial enthusiasm, you had great, products selling for very large amounts of money and a lot of, consumers buying them. It's easy to think that's going to be forever. And I think it's proven to not be the case. And I think we actually, when states have come online later on since Massachusetts, I think we've only seen a shortening of that time span in terms of that enthusiasm. There's that big rush initially, but then you got to realize that this is just like any other business. You got to make sense of your dollars and cents, and you got to make sure your profit margins are there. And, it's just a tough thing to sustain.
We've been talking about this from a sort of Rev Clinics perspective, an industry perspective, and on the industry side of this conversation, but it is a heavily regulated industry, and regulators in Massachusetts can't seem to keep themselves out of the news. You follow this industry in Massachusetts. Talk about the latest with the CCC. I mean, it's based down the street from you. Like, talk a little bit about that, because, I mean, I don't know if it's weekly, but it's close to weekly where there's something coming out of Massachusetts regulators. Talk a little bit about that, because I think that is, while I don't think that is the cause of what's happening at Rev Clinics, it is a cause for concern for states still looking to legalize or get their regulatory affairs in order when they see a more mature state still having challenges on the regulatory side.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, when Massachusetts legalized, it set up an independent state agency called the Cannabis Control Commission. While the 5 commissioners are actually appointed by a combination of the governor, the attorney general, and the treasurer, it's actually supposed to be a completely independent agency that acts on its own. And I think that's a double-edged sword. I think it's great to have that freedom of not having, the governor meddle in your affairs, or at least not supposed to be meddling in the affairs, or the treasurer meddling in the agency. But I think there was kind of an accountability vacuum, and we've had a number of issues. Obviously, I think the thing that's caught the headlines the most was the firing of the chair, Shannon O'Brien, by her appointing power, the treasurer of the state. That ended up in a 2-year legal battle. And then, I believe last week, the judge issued a ruling saying that firing was actually inappropriate, that, Shannon O'Brien may not be a saint, but, under the state law, the treasurer has a very kind of narrow scope that they can actually fire a commissioner who's supposed to be, independent. And that even though, again, Senator O'Brien might have not been the best chair in some people's view, that she didn't cross any line that actually gave the treasurer the right to fire her. So now, 2 years after being suspended and then fired, she could be coming back to the commission as the chair. I'm kind of reminded of that famous Vince McMahon gif where he's kind of walking down and making his entrance back into the ring. It's shocking. It's something out of a soap opera, if you will, to have her come back after 2 years and potentially be in charge of the commission again, at least as the chair. So that's being appealed. I think we might actually get a ruling today on whether that appeal is going to be upheld or what's going to happen. But yeah, and even within the commission, you kind of have this accountability bubble because, it's kind of unclear. The commissioners are supposed to kind of have overview of the commission, but the executive director runs the day-to-day affairs. And really, again, the only power they can kind of have is to get rid of the executive director and replace them. So this is kind of a interesting situation with the commission where it's really kind of hard to see where the buck stops or where the accountability actually is. It's kind of like a Ouija board where everybody's kind of pushing in one direction or the other, but it's not really going in any planned direction. So it's just, a kind of fascinating thing to see play out. But, for these businesses, it's really tough when you got, kind of inconsistent enforcement of regulations, or you have difficulty getting an answer out of regulators in terms of what you can and cannot do. That can make it, even more challenging to run a cannabis business. So.
Yeah. And I think, Eric, to make this conversation a little bit forward-looking, thinking about that regulatory uncertainty, thinking about the wholesale price collapses, the market saturation, all the things, you've touched on in the story. I wanted to bring in this quote that you ended with from Madoff, who the attorney handling the receivership. He said, "It seems like the people that can withstand saturation are the people with really deep pockets. It does not seem like there's room for mom and pops." I mean, I sort of abridged the quote. In your view, what are the lessons that we can learn from Rev clinics from Massachusetts about supporting small businesses and making sure that there is diversity in the market? And I'm sorry for the dog barking.
Sorry.
Dog is so mad.
Yeah.
He has some thoughts on this. Yeah, he's really opinionated.
Mom and pops. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's tough. And, it was interesting. I kind of called David in the 11th hour working on this piece because, he's a lawyer. He's a coin-appointed receiver. He didn't have any ties to Rev clinics or even the cannabis industry before this. This is actually the first cannabis business he's dealt with in his long career of handling bankruptcies and kind of winding down of companies. So I think his thoughts there are fairly accurate in terms of, you really need deep pockets to be able to survive the current market conditions. Any type of debt service is really difficult to deal with. So if you're a type of business who had enough startup capital to kind of fund yourself and not have to rely on acquiring debt, especially in this industry where access to traditional banking isn't there, and you're paying, really absurd interest rates or the equivalent of interest rates on a lot of this capital you're able to access. So I think it's been really tough. And for mom and pops, there has been some success stories here in Massachusetts, but for the most part, it's been really difficult for them to kind of sustain this price crunch. We've seen the amount of debt that, some of these big MSOs are able to accumulate and still kind of keep running, keep ticking. For these smaller businesses, that really isn't possible. And something else that the story brings up, of course, is that bankruptcy isn't an option for cannabis businesses. Right. So we've seen a number of them go into receivership. I cover a few of those in the story. But it's a real challenge for these businesses, even the wind down. David, this is his first experience with a cannabis business, and he talked about some of the challenges compared to some of the kind of the tools in his tool belt he usually has when it's a typical bankruptcy case. So it's so funny that even winding down a cannabis business is challenging. So there's nothing about this industry that's easy.
Right. That's the quote right there for sure. Nothing about the industry is easy. And before we do sort of wrap up, because coming up in time, I do want to. I'd love to be able to check in with you about sort of Massachusetts, what's happening over time as well. So we hope to have you back. As Jeremy said, thinking about the future of what's happening in Massachusetts, not so much about the mom and pop, but really about the competition that is now different and apart from 2 years ago, where a lot of people from sort of the capital region were shopping Western Massachusetts. A lot of people from Connecticut were shopping in Western Massachusetts. The industry is so dynamic and changes all the time. But even over the course of the past 2 years, New York, Connecticut, Vermont, all started adult use recreational sales. Is there a sense of what that has done? Maybe not so much for central Massachusetts, but for Western Massachusetts and the industry as a whole. It must have refactored how people think about the industry in Massachusetts.
Yeah, if you look at a map of cannabis businesses, especially dispensaries here in Massachusetts, you'll notice there's a huge accumulation along the borders of Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire. And, despite being the live free or die state, New Hampshire is the one that hasn't joined into the party. But obviously Rhode Island and Connecticut have. They're a little bit behind us, both in terms of pricing and some of the regulations there are even less consumer friendly than they are here in Massachusetts. So I think that's kind of helped businesses. I think we still see a lot of cross-border traffic. You see some kind of shocking numbers in terms of municipalities on the border and how much they bring in terms of tax revenue. in otherwise small communities. So I think they still have that going, but obviously I think that kind of plays into a larger idea that there's less enthusiasm around here. Prices are lower. I think consumers have kind of figured out what they want and how much they want to consume on in their life in terms of, I think after legalization, I think everybody gets a little excited and you kind of take a step back and say, maybe I should smoke a little less or consume a little less. So I think on that, you're seeing that on kind of a grander scale play out. Although sales are still good. I mean, that's the weird paradox about this industry is that, we have $8 billion in sales since legalization came online. They've already passed the 1 billion mark this year. So we're still seeing a lot of money come in, but it's that weird paradox where the industry is making a lot of money and nobody's getting rich, it seems. So.
Yeah, and I mean, just sort of observation on that. It seems like for Rev clinics, timing is everything in business, right? And there's just some unfortunate aspects of being a little too early or being on the wrong side of the price curve that a lot of the industry is feeling right now. I mean, there's a lot of well-run businesses, there's a lot of not so well-run businesses at the same time, but timing really matters, and I think this story definitely shows that.
Yeah, I think so too. And one thing we didn't get into is the David Ortiz aspect of this, which is also fascinating. The whole celebrity brand world in general in cannabis is kind of interesting that even somebody as prominent as David Ortiz, who's obviously a sports icon and legend around here for reasons that go kind of beyond sports in terms of how he responded to the Boston Marathon bombing and other things like that. And even he couldn't, get a successful celebrity cannabis brand off the ground. So that's kind of fascinating to see as well.
Yeah.
He's
also our household's first pick if we're building an all-time baseball team. So
that's a good choice. Yeah.
Like if you have to have a cannabis Texas cannabis or be the number one pick on that, the Rosenthal all-time Red Sox team, he's still a winner in our book, and we owe a great debt of gratitude to him as Red Sox fans.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
Yes.
so let's not badmouth David Ortiz, Jeremy. Okay. We're not pinning this on him. But appreciate you, Eric, and thank you, Jeremy, for joining us this morning as well. We'll connect with you as time goes on to check in what's happening in Massachusetts. Great story on Rev Clinics. You can find it on cultivated.news. You can find it on the Worcester Business Journal. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.